All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second session of our Municipal Grid Resilience series. So today's theme is Bright Ideas for a Stormy Future, Strengthening Southern Maine's Resilience to Power Outages. I'm Gretchen Anderson. I'm a Sustainability Program Coordinator with the Greater Portland Council of Governments. Next slide, Gabe. So we've designed today's session to build on the foundation we set in the first webinar. So I'm going to start with a little context and some of the goals behind this series. And then I'll turn things over to Karina Graeter from SMPDC, who will be sharing the local examples and the ideas for how communities and/or utilities can strengthen resilience. And then we'll close with plenty of time for questions and discussion. Next slide, Gabe. So we reviewed this in the first webinar, but for those that may not know us as well or are joining in on the second session, GPCOG is a regional planning organization. We support our communities with sustainability, transportation, broadband, land use, and economic development services, as well as partnering with other regional planning organizations. Next slide, Gabe. So we're also part of the Southern Maine or the Southern Mid-Coast Resilience Collaborative. This network brings municipalities and regional organizations together to maximize efficiencies, share resources, and strengthen climate resilience. So through this cohort or collaboration, those communities have access to regional training, shared tools through a centralized hub. Next slide, Gabe. So within this series specifically, GPCOG's role, we kind of identified through our strategic plan, as well as talking with other planning organizations, trying to help municipalities understand the challenges and opportunities of our evolving electric grid. So things like growing demand, decarbonization, and resilience to severe weather. Just as importantly, we want to lift up ways municipalities lift up ways for municipalities to have a stronger voice in the decision-making process and identifying opportunities to build grid resilience across the region, the state, New England. It expands infinitely. Next slide. So like I said, in our first session, we heard from the Acadia Center and the Maine PUC about the integrated grid planning and how municipalities can engage in that process. That conversation helps set the foundation for today's session, which shifts the focus more to local action and examples of how communities and organizations in Southern Maine are strengthening resilience to power outages, or at least getting the conversation started of what that looks like. And with that, I'll turn it over to Karina from SMPDC to lead us through today's presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Gretchen. As I get my presentation shared here, I'll just introduce myself a bit. I am Karina Graeter. I'm the Sustainability and Resilience Division Director at SMPDC, or Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission. Let me just pull this up. How's that look? Great. All right, and yes, as Gretchen introduced, we're sharing some of the work we've been doing on grid resilience planning here in Southern Maine. And so today, my hope is to share with you the initial results of some assessment of power outages in our region, where they're happening and why, and what impacts they're having on our communities, and talk about how that fits into a planning process we're doing right here, hopefully identifying some actions and strategies that we and our partners and our municipalities can take to improve resilience to power outages. So with that, the agenda for today is I'll start a little bit about our motivation behind this project, where it came from. Then I'll share the assessment findings, so some preliminary findings from the data we've gotten from Central Maine Power about power outages, where they're happening, what impact they're having. And then, like I said, talking at the end about the plan that this all will lead into. And as I go along, I will be happy to take questions. You can either put questions in the chat or you can raise your hand, and I'll pause throughout as we're sort of shifting through this agenda to make sure we take time for those as we go along. And then also, before I dive in, I just want to recognize that this work that SMPDC is doing is receiving a lot of support. We have funding from the Economic Development Administration. We received an EDA disaster grant to support this project. And we are also supported by a really wonderful consulting team that has a lot of energy expertise and expertise that is relevant to the region and the ongoing challenges we face. So this is that team here. We're led by London Economics International and Sayad Mochadaru and Faith Huntington, who is an advisor. We are also supported by RLC Engineering, and then some of you may recognize David Plum from the Consensus Building Institute, who is leading our stakeholder and community engagement. So much of the information I share today will be come from the work that they all have done, and we're very grateful for their support on this project. So moving on into the motivation. Now, right now it is summer. It is sunny and warm, and even this past winter was not very extreme. There weren't a ton of extreme storms. So to focus ourselves, I wanted to bring in some examples of some of the power outages that have motivated us to do this project. So here is a photo and a headline from Portland Press Herald of the storm on April 4th in 2024. When a nor'easter came up the coast and caused a lot of power outages, a lot in York County. It brought heavy, wet snow that really impacted distribution lines. And you can see here this whole distribution pole and the lines attached to it all fell on this plow truck. So it caused tons of outages for several days for many of our communities. And similarly, back in December 18th in 2023, there was a storm that caused tons of power outages and was associated with flooding, especially along inland rivers. And that flooding actually flooded substations and other infrastructure that really impacted the power outages and caused them to have long durations with really complicated cleanup. And then the final example is in December of Christmas time, December 23rd, 2022, thousands were without power due to really heavy winds that blew down trees on the distribution lines, like you can see here. And I don't know if you guys were like me, but we spent the holidays huddled around the wood stove that year. So it was certainly interesting, but I would not want to repeat it again. So with that, power outages are a huge challenge for all of us, but there are some things that particularly motivated us to want to do this energy resilience planning project. And that's what we heard from our communities when we were doing climate action planning. We heard that power outages were a huge health and safety concern, especially for the community's most vulnerable residents. So folks who are older and rely on equipment that is powered by electricity are especially vulnerable to power outages, or who have limited mobility and can get stuck in the dark in their homes, or young kids during power outages who are maybe more sensitive to extreme temperatures, and when they lose heat, that can be a big issue. We also heard that power outages were a big challenge for our region's businesses. That power outages caused businesses to close and could risk their supplies and their stocks, especially businesses with freezers. So we heard that that was a big concern. And all of that together was during our climate action planning processes we did over the past few years. This was a priority through all the communities. So we at SMPDC sort of established addressing grid resilience as a regional priority for addressing climate change. And that led us to then pursue this project, to pursue the grant funding and undertake this work. And so here is a lovely graph of sort of this regional energy resilience planning process. because we wanted to, knowing that this was an issue, we wanted to ensure that there was a plan that specifically addressed the needs of our region. So here is sort of outlined this sort of standard planning process. We began in late fall of 2024. We brought on board our consultant team and we started this regional energy resilience assessment, where I'm going to share some of the results of that today. We also established a stakeholder group that consists of representatives across basically the whole spectrum of organizations and people that use, make, and regulate electricity. So utility providers, renewable energy providers, large businesses, small businesses, social service organizations, to ensure that the plan is reflective of what they view are their needs and the challenges that they're facing. We're also doing community engagement to share that with the broader community and incorporate other considerations, and all that will lead into an actual plan that will be finished by February 2026. And so that is sort of the motivation. So before I jump into the actual data, does anyone have any comments or questions about that before we dig in a little deeper? All right, great. Well, that was the straightforward stuff. Now we'll get into the actual data, which is a bit more complicated. So to begin, while SMPDC represents York County and Southern Oxford County, our region does not necessarily align with the regions that Central Maine Power and the other utilities use to do their grid planning. And so we decided to align this plan with Central Maine Power's Alfred Service District. That's the area in this map in light green. And so if you have a kind of a sense of county boundaries, that is mostly York County, but there's little bits of Southern Oxford County, like Porter and Hiram, and little bits of Cumberland County that are in that district. And you can also see the district doesn't align always with where municipalities have their borders. So it presents some interesting challenges as we go through this data. Another unique thing about this region is that in Kennebunk, we have Kennebunk Light and Power District, or KLPD. That is a community-owned distribution area. So they have their own system that coordinates with the Central Maine Power system, but is separate. And also, because they are so small, they have less requirements related to reporting power outages. And so that presents an interesting challenge of they don't have the same level of data that Central Maine Power can provide, but we do have some anecdotal and qualitative data about the reliability in that region too. And so to ground this sort of in power outages across the state, we looked at some data provided by Climate Central that looks at Department of Energy recorded weather-related major power outages. So major power outages are those where the power outage affects 50,000 or more customers in a state, or results in 300 megawatts or more of electrical load loss. So these are the big power outages that usually are related to large winter storms or other high impact events. And what we can see is that from 2006 to 2023, there's been a sharp increase in the number of major power outage events. Not every year is it extra high now, but it's overall on average increasing and has more than tripled in the past 20 years. And this is statewide. We don't have data just for our region going back to 2006, but we expect the pattern to be the same, that over the past 2 decades, the number of major power outage events have increased significantly, and these are mostly due to extreme weather and storm events. So once we started digging into the region-specific data, we wanted to look at what is causing these power outages. So what is actually the thing that triggers the fault to happen on the electrical line that causes the power to stop flowing, the electrons to stop flowing through the circuit and actually results in the power outage. CMP reports this data in their power outage data by circuit. You can see for every power outage where the fault occurred, when it occurred, how many customers impacted, and what they attributed the cause of the outage to. And unsurprisingly, but overwhelmingly, the leading cause of power outages in the Alfred Service District are trees. So trees represent this large section in green and the smaller section in orange, resulting in almost 89% of the power outages, whether it is weather related or not. And so I think that's unsurprising, but Maine is a very forested state and we have a lot of trees, but I don't think we realized how many of the power outages it caused, especially when we often think of like York County as being maybe more developed than some of the farther north regions of the state, that this is an issue that we're seeing and probably the whole state is seeing. And in particular, what was surprising was the number of the outages that are attributed to trees outside of the utilities right of way. So that's the ones in green. So those are the trees that Central Maine Power or your utility don't have regulatory authority to do anything about, basically. They can only trim what's within their right of way, and if it's outside, they can work with customers to deal with them, but oftentimes there's nothing that they can do. And then the last point about this cause is, one thing that's concerning about it is that with a warmer climate in the future, that's likely to accelerate vegetation growth. So this problem isn't going to be going away. It might be getting worse in the future. So that's overall the whole region, what's causing the power outages. And then we wanted to look at how that varied from circuit to circuit throughout the region. So one thing that we looked at was the number of power outages or number of incidents per circuit, and then looked at how that compared based on how long the circuit is, because a circuit length is determined by, the number of customers that are hooked up to that circuit and how far apart they're located. In more developed areas, there are shorter circuits because there are lots of customers in a close area. But in more rural areas, there might be a mile, half a mile between different homes. So the circuit lines are much longer. And again, kind of intuitively, we saw that the longer the circuit is, there are many more outages on that circuit over the study period. And you can see that most of the circuits are about 0 to 50 miles long, and those tend to have a lower number of incidents. But as you get these less common but longer circuits, the number of outages really increases. And here on this map are the top 5 in terms of number of incidents. And then on the next page, I have a map showing you where those are located. So this makes sense. The longer the circuit is, the more it is exposed to those trees that we mentioned are causing all the power outages. But I think what was surprising to our team was just the extreme variability in length of circuit, and how those fewer really long circuits are really experiencing the majority of the outages. So bear with me with this squiggle map, but these are where the circuits are mapped over the region, and the color of the circuits indicates the number of outages. So the lighter in color it is, the fewer outages the circuit experienced during the study period. The darker reds are the circuits with the higher number of outages. And this was just to help us understand where these are located, because one circuit can span multiple communities, which makes it hard. And so highlighted on here are those top 5 circuits that experience the most number of outages. Number 1 is the circuit that covers mostly Parsonsfield, parts of Cornish and Limerick, experiencing 225 incidents. And I also put on here that their average weather-related outage was 23 hours in length, so almost a whole day just on average over the 3 years. The second one was this circuit 61D2D2, which is Acton and Shapley. And circuit 3 is in North Berwick. And then 4 and 5 are also circuits along the border. So you can see that these circuits in the most rural, remote parts of our state are experiencing the most frequent outages. They're the longest circuits as well. And the exception is kind of this one in North Berwick, which is not quite as long as the others and not so remote. So it's kind of interesting. We're not quite sure what's happening there yet. So here's another squiggle map that shows, instead of the number of incidents, this is the average duration of a weather-related power outage, with, again, the lighter colors are where the average weather power outage length was lower, and the darker the color, these dark black, are the longest average. And so one thing I think that's important to call out is that there was not a single circuit in our region where over this period the average weather-related outage was less than 8 hours. So when you think about how long it takes for your fridge to lose enough cool to keep all the cool in it, or how long a business needs to be able to keep their freezers cold, 8 hours can maybe serve as sort of a minimum for planning purposes. And I think is longer than any of us really enjoy having our power out for. And then there are some general trends that more developed areas experience relatively shorter weather-related outage durations on average than the inland communities. You can see, sort of along the coast, along the I-95 corridor, the durations are shorter versus those areas we were talking about along the western border of the state. Their average duration is longer. And in Lebanon, it's over 1 day on average. It's above 32 to 40 hours. And there are a couple of reasons for this. This is all about how long it takes for CMP to restore the circuit and bring it back online. One is CMP prioritizes critical services in those areas where there are fire stations and police stations and hospitals. Those are brought back online first. Also, low density is important because they want to bring as many customers back online as possible, as fast as possible, because that helps them with their reliability reporting. And also, these long circuits, the power outage might not just be caused by one tree, it might be caused by 24 trees, and that takes a long time for the utility to clean up and might be compromised by other issues of inaccessibility of getting to those more remote regions of the state. And then one other variable to this that's important to consider is, when are these outages happening? And are all these incidents happening at individual times or all at the same time? Because that's really important for emergency management planning and for that restoration planning. And so this is a map of 2023 of the customer outage hours by week, or by a couple weeks, by 2 weeks. And customer outage hours is when you take the duration of the incident times the number of customers who experienced it to get an estimate of the total impact of the power outage. And so you can see that in 2023, the majority of customer outage hours occurred during like a few discrete storm events. And we can even align these with storms that were reported about in the news or were recorded by NOAA. So for example, there was a severe winter storm in January of 2023 that caused a significant number of outages. In March, there was a nor'easter. In August, there was a hurricane that brought some strong winds and caused some power outages. And then on December 18th, the highest one, that was that big wind and rain storm that had a lot of flooding that caused those significant outages. So yeah, it's helpful to look at number of incidents and averages, but we are really looking at extreme events that impact the whole region. And that's important to take into consideration when we're thinking about the strategies that will help improve the community's resilience to power outages. Okay, and then the last outage reliability issue I wanted to talk about was how climate change is going to impact all of this. Because as we all know, the climate is changing, and so our experience with power outages today might be changing rapidly in the future. And the utilities are aware of this, and the state has required the utilities to do climate change planning. So CMP has produced a climate change vulnerability study, which is on their climate change planning webpage. And it's really interesting and really detailed, so I'd recommend anyone who's interested to take a look. And so our team went through that study that looked at what are the climate hazards in the future, and how is CMP's assets and infrastructure and operations vulnerable to that. We went through and pulled out from that study what was relevant to our region and our plan. And so some of that is highlighted here on this slide. The hazard, for example, extreme storm events. From all this data we've shown you, it's clear that extreme storm events are causing the majority of these power outages. And with climate change, it's anticipated that these events will become more intense and possibly more frequent. So what that means for our region is that the power outages we've been experiencing, we are going to continue to experience and might even become worse, especially when you start thinking about how these storms are a little warmer, sometimes the snow's wetter, or there's freezing rain, or there's more wind. So we can expect it to be at least the same, if not worse, if resilience improvements aren't made. Another interesting hazard that CMP highlighted in their vulnerability study was inland flooding. And they actually noted that their system was more vulnerable to inland flooding than it is to coastal flooding, which is interesting. And they actually went to the extent of identifying which substations are at risk from flooding of their infrastructure. Here in Southern Maine, we have 15 substations that are at risk, at least moderate risk of flooding, and 2 are at high risk of inland flooding. And so that's a priority for us to ensure that CMP is taking that into account in their future investments in the grid. And similarly, a circuit in Old Orchard Beach is the 3rd most vulnerable to inland flooding. So that means, the poles, the lines, the other ground level circuit infrastructure beyond the substations is at risk too. Coastal flooding is still a significant hazard, and in our region, there are 3 substations that will be at moderate risk of flooding in a future with 2 feet of sea level rise. And another circuit in Old Orchard Beach, not the same one, but is CMP's most vulnerable to coastal flooding in their whole territory. So flooding is definitely of a concern for us here in Southern Maine. And then another hazard that was particularly interesting that they called out was extreme heat. It's increasing in frequency, as we've all probably experienced this summer. And of all the areas of CMP's region, the Alfred District is the most vulnerable to the impacts of extreme heat. And, as we looked at that graph of when the power outages were occurring over the course of the year, most major impactful power outages have not been occurring in the summer. And I would say a lot of our communities are unfamiliar with how to manage a long-term power outage during warm temperatures or extreme heat events. So that was something we highlighted as sort of a new threat that we need to think about as part of this planning process. Okay, so those are the outages, the data on the outages. Before I dive into the impacts, are there any questions or clarifications on what I presented?
Karina, we did have one question. It was during the pie graph slide. Specifically, they wanted to know Kate wanted to know the time frame for when that data was collected.
Oh yeah, great question, Kate. And sorry, I forgot to mention that. So CMP provided us with the circuit level outage data for the years of 2022, 2023, and 2024. And so we chose to aggregate all the data for those 3 years together to give us the most comprehensive picture. So it's 2022 to 2024.
Okay, great, Karina. And then I also had a question about other. Would that be like vehicle related incidents and the like?
Yeah. So in the outage data, they have a list of like 30 different causes. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, and they get really specific. So it can be like vehicle impacting a pole, vehicle impacting a substation, and similarly, it could be tree falling on a line, tree hitting a transformer, all that stuff. So
Oh, wow.
other really is a hodgepodge of a million different things that only cause like an outage here or there throughout the study period.
Great.
There's one more question I see. Sorry, I accidentally changed slides. So in the future, how will data currently collected by NOAA how will the data be collected? That's a good question that I don't know the answer to. I mean, the outage data will be collected by the utilities. They are required by the state and also for like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to do that. So that's not changing, but the weather-related data, I think your guess is as best as mine what's going to happen with that in the future. All right, so we'll move on to outage impacts. So, these outages are occurring, but how are they impacting our community members? And so we've collected information on the impacts throughout our planning process as part of our community and stakeholder engagement. We held several focus groups in the spring, one with businesses and one with particularly vulnerable community members. And we asked them about how power outages are impacting them and their friends and their neighbors. And there were, some standout comments we wanted to share with the group of what we were hearing that all sort of point to that these impacts are really personal and affect people very deeply and businesses very deeply. So one slaughterhouse in Southern Maine mentioned how they have 12,000 pounds of meat in their freezers. So when power goes out in the winter, it's not such a big deal. But if they were ever to lose power in the summer, in 4 hours, they would lose all of that supply. And they currently don't have a plan for how to manage that. Similarly, we heard from a senior citizen about warming and cooling centers. We were talking about how that can be a solution, but they said that since the warming center doesn't allow pets, they wouldn't go. So how, that's an impact on them where even though a solution might be proposed, it might not be the right fit for them and their needs. Another quote was senior citizens in our program told us stories of being in the dark, unable to get out of their 6-story building, and how that was very frightening. And so these events can be scary and traumatic and have impacts far beyond just people losing what's in their refrigerator or not being able to go to work that day, that it can be compounding. And then hearing from a business about how to, on their own, deal with power outages. They looked into on-demand backup power with batteries, but the costs were just exorbitant and prohibitive. So not something that they could do, and they're still trying to look for solutions. We also tried to dig a little deeper into the cost of power outages, especially since this is an economic development and administration funded project. We wanted to ensure that the economic impacts were incorporated. We used a program called the ICE calculator to look at the cost per every power outage interruption to businesses, small and large, in the region, based on the current reliability in the region, and it estimated that losses from power outages were over $28 million from 2022 to 2024. Those are just direct costs. So that is, the cost of not being able to provide your business and the output of your business for that time, but doesn't take into account, longer term costs of employees not being able to come into work or having to delay things that you are time dependent on other things, or tourism, things like that. So this is a starting point And we also got a little bit of more data from some of the businesses that are involved in our focus groups and in our stakeholder group. One business in the focus group mentioned that for every hour that they didn't have power, they were losing $4,000 per hour. And this was a business that lost power a lot. So the impacts are real and something that we want to take into account in our planning process as well. And then lastly, we also talked to the folks who attended our annual meeting about this project and about power outages. Our SMPDC's annual meeting is attended by municipal staff, committee members, partner organizations, and so we asked them for their communities what were the biggest impacts they saw for power outages. And overwhelmingly, people mentioned the loss of heat and cooling for their community members, and heat and water as well, for what they saw as the biggest impact and the biggest challenge. But a lot of other things related to emergency response, like communication disruptions, or emergency response delays, travel disruptions, and impacts on vulnerable groups. So a lot of similar things that we're hearing. And this has really helped us think about, not only do we need to have this plan focus on how can the grid be more resilient, but shifting our mindset as well to how can our communities be more resilient to power outages, because it's unrealistic, especially in a changing climate future, to think that power outages are going to go away enough that we don't have to worry about them. And so what can we do to help our communities be able to manage through those power outage events and also recover faster after them? And so understanding these impacts more has been really valuable in incorporating that into our plan. All right, so that's the impacts. Any questions before I move along to what's happening with this planning process next? All right. Okay, so our next steps, and now that we're wrapping up this assessment, is to actually develop the plan itself, to move on to picking out where are we going to focus and what actions and strategies are we going to include in the plan. And so we've kind of coalesced around sort of two pathways that this plan will take. The first is to develop a plan that recommends priority actions, and that these recommendations are really for us, SMPDC, as the regional planning organization and the economic development organization for the region, as well as our partners and our partner communities, to take to make our communities more resilient to power outages. But then the second pathway of this is that helping us and our communities in the region influencing what's happening at the state and utility level. Because as we've been doing this planning process, and you probably heard in the first session of the series, there's a lot going on that the state and the utilities are doing to plan and prepare for climate change and to address grid resilience challenges. And so part of the goals of this plan is to bring Southern Maine into that discussion and ensure that the work we're doing is aligned with and takes advantage of the opportunities that are happening at the state level, and that the state level work is informed by what's important in our region. And so some common themes we've been hearing from our stakeholders that we want to incorporate into this plan, and by I'll say stakeholders and our community engagement, is that implement infrastructure and technical solutions to minimize outages. So addressing how can we minimize outages is important, and helping CMP or encouraging them to do that where it makes the most sense is vital to improving grid resilience. Supporting communities and local businesses to manage power outages, and then offering tools for municipalities around and businesses around better communication and financial resources for their own efforts to reduce the impacts of power outages. And then finally, one other theme we've been incorporating into this process is the need to tailor our strategies to account for differences across the region. So strategies that are important to communities like Lebanon and Parsonsfield, where they have these really impactful power outages caused by weather events, might be different than the strategies needed in the more developed areas where there are lots of businesses that might be more impacted by, to be honest, by squirrels is something we're hearing. That solutions might vary, and we want to make sure that we have solutions that will be helpful for everyone in the planning process. And so finally, where we are at is we are developing some focus areas for our plan, and these are our draft focus areas right now. Our hope is to refine these and then use these focus areas to start selecting strategies that will end up in the plan. So these focus areas are emerging threats, so steps to prepare for extreme heat and flooding of vulnerable infrastructure. Critical infrastructure, so additional steps to make critical facilities more resilient, like warming and cooling centers and adding microgrids and backup power. Risks from trees, so offer ideas to work collaboratively on the threats for trees outside of the right-of-way, which is a big question, I think, at the moment. Better communication, especially between Central Maine Power and municipalities, to help accelerate restoration efforts. Support for households and businesses, identifying the most effective supports for local businesses and community organizations to manage during power outages. And then offer clear regional priorities and state regulatory processes to help influence utility proceedings. And so on that second path of this project, wanting to sort of help us identify what's important to our region in these utility proceedings, I just wanted to highlight two of those that are, or three of those proceedings that are happening right now. That's one of the challenges we're facing, is that we're still planning, but the state and the utilities are making decisions right now. And so how do we balance getting our plan done and getting everything clear with the need to engage right now? For example, CMP is currently working on their 5-year rate plan, and once approved, electricity rates will, in the plan, the electricity rates will be linked to CMP's 5-year priority investments that are laid out in the plan, and those rates will be passed on to what consumers pay for electricity. And also right now is going on the utilities integrated grid planning processes and climate change protection plan processes. And so the priorities outlined in those plans will probably be incorporated into future rate plans for the utilities. So one of our hopes is to, before this plan is even done, have sort of the list of the focus areas and what's important to our region, so that, and figure out a way to get that incorporated into these processes, because they're happening now, and I think part of our discussion can be how are municipalities getting involved in all of that. And so that's really it. We're like in the middle of the planning process, and we don't have strategies yet to share. We have a lot of ideas, and I'm really interested in hearing feedback from you all about what's important to your communities and what strategies you think could end up in the plan. But I just want to say thank you. And are there any other questions that folks have?
Karina, I just have a quick question. Are you doing anything right now to support your municipalities in engaging with the two planning processes you outlined that CMP and the state are doing, or do you have examples of what?
We are not doing anything yet.
Yeah, that's where we are too. I'm just, yeah, it'd be great to get together and we can talk about it, because I do think it's tough that those are happening right now and are going to be so influential in the future, but we, don't have a great way to engage right now.
I would also piggyback on Sarah's comment that Callie just put in the chat. There are two meetings occurring for CMP, one through the climate planning and the other one for integrated grid planning. And there's the team's invites there if anyone is interested in attending.
Karina, before we get to the discussion, I just was wondering if you would share your thoughts on the your project overall and the process and the funding mechanism and how replicable it would be for other regions to take this on?
Yeah. Honestly, I think if the utilities are willing to provide the data for other regions, then the work of doing the like outage data assessment is very replicable and I think very interesting, and like we've only really scratched the surface of sort of what that data can tell us about isolating places where power outages are happening and which communities they're in, and then talking to the communities about their experiences. I think the EDA funding, it was a great source of funding for this, and I do think it would be accessible to other communities. It is related to disaster events, and most of the disaster events we've had in recent years have caused significant power outages, so it's very easy to justify that. And yeah, I think that one thing that we did in designing this process is tried to make it really simple. I mean, it really is a very standard assess, plan, engage, write the plan, and I think that's helpful in terms of trying to get this done quickly so that it can align with what's happening at the state. And I think what is needed at this point, because we're not really yet ready to grapple with like really difficult conversations with communities that might require a more extensive planning process. So that's a long way of saying, yes, I think it's replicable, and yes, I think there could be funding for it.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Great. Well, I will stop sharing, and then I have a couple questions for folks who are here. If people are willing to chime in and come off mute or put answers in the chat about our planning process, just about what I've shared and your reactions to it. I think the first one Sarah already brought up about we at SMPDC are not yet really engaging our communities on what's happening at the utility level with these regulatory processes. And so we wanted to know, are any communities engaging in these regulatory processes in Maine? And if so, how are you doing it? And if you're not, like, how could you see your community doing it? Or are there barriers to you getting involved?
I could start from the GP cog side, just narratively hearing from communities. It's just,
Sure.
It feels a bit of like a black box. And I think that's why this series bubbled up, is because I think we as staff are trying to get our hands around like what this process is and how to be engaged. And with so much happening all at once, it feels at times reactive, especially for the scale of which communities we serve, from the Portlands to the Bridgetons. There's varying needs and priorities, and how do we as an organization balance all of that in potentially an economies of scale response? So that's the long and the short of what I viewing from just the short time in which we've been having this series happen.
Yeah, and Jen put in the chat, is there a guide for municipalities for how to engage? I don't think there is a guide. David, good to see you. Shout out to David for all his work on this project.
Hey everybody, I'm part of the consultant team, not the technical, but more the sort of engagement team on this. And I was just going to mention, and I joined a little late, Karina, you might have said this, but one of the benefits of having a technical team involved is there are some technical outputs here that would form the basis of sort of your, I'm going to use advocacy lightly, but the way you want to shape a CMP's decisions or the state's decisions. So the technical team can say, you know what, the most cost-effective way to deal with this kind of problem is this, this, and this, particularly if it's important for Southern Maine or wherever your region is. And so I think one of the things Karina's going to come out of this with is some technical support for arguing for certain types of actions. And as we know with utilities, it's tricky because we as ratepayers pay for all of it. So you really want to be thoughtful about what you're recommending to make sure it's the cost-effective thing to do, since we're going to pay for it.
Great, David. Yeah, that's a great point. And Jen also mentioned in the chat, our community has engaged with CMP in the past when the new solar fields caused an issue with the infrastructure. CMP did not want to expand their infrastructure. And then she asked, how do we know what would be cost effective or not? And I think that's part of what David was saying, is that at least in our plan, we will look to, London Economics, our consultant team, and RLC Engineering for helping us evaluate what to put forward as cost effective solutions. All right, well, thank you for that. And I think that shows us that there's a lot of groundwork to cover to be getting municipalities and ourselves, I think, to the point of being able to engage thoughtfully in these processes. But a few other questions we had that I wanted to bring to the group was thinking back to the results that we shared about Southern Maine. I was curious from the group of how does this compare to what you're seeing in your community? Or are you seeing something completely different that, makes your area unique to what we're experiencing? Are you seeing similar lengths of power outages? Are you seeing similar causes? Are there other causes that are an issue for you? We just love to hear a little bit about, we've been head deep in this data, like how does that compare to what you're experiencing?
Jen put in the chat that the power outages have been increasing significantly on the mid-coast. And as someone who works for Greater Portland Council of Governments, but actually lives in Buxton, I would also say inland is also experiencing an increase of power outages. And, Karina, I was right there with you on the December 2023 storm of bringing in Christmas with no power. And it's not only just the effect of, I would say, on your groceries and the heat, and it's also like the livelihood aspect of it of, it's not an ideal thing to be doing during a holiday, and just the mental toll, I think, is also something that maybe we should elevate a bit, in addition to the monetary.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, your talk of the coastal versus inland is interesting because I had an interesting conversation with Tora Johnson at Sunrise Economic Development Council way up in Washington County. And they're also doing some grid resilience planning work. And I was telling her what we're seeing in our data. And she was surprised that even in Southern Maine, we were having as extensive and as big of power outages that they were having. And so I think, that's sort of getting the state or other regions to understand where folks are experiencing these and who all is experiencing these impacts is really important. And Judy mentioned in the chat that data reflects what they've been experiencing in Kittery. So that's great to hear, Judy. And Jen also mentioned lots of damage with those coastal storms in the past 2 years. That's definitely true. And then new Mainers do not have the knowledge on how to manage storms and no power. That is a great point, that it takes, some lived experience sometime to figure out how to best manage these in the place you live and what you're going to do better next time. And so maybe some strategies around education about what to do in power outages could be really helpful. So another question I had for the group is, what role can different municipal staff and community members and partner organizations play in increasing resilience to power outages? I think we have a good idea sort of what emergency management can do, or what the county EMA can do, but are there other folks involved in communities that are important to take into account when thinking about these strategies and engaging on these strategies?
Karina, as people are thinking of their answers, I'm just curious if, and related, I guess, to your question, is future electrification, like beneficial electrification planning, factoring into your study in terms of, I mean, assessing obviously what's vulnerable now, but then looking into the future as we need, we were really even more reliant on the grid as we start to beneficially electrify. Are you thinking about that? And is that coming into the study at all?
We're definitely thinking about it, especially in the area of like our focus areas and what actions end up in the plan, but it wasn't within the scope of the project to do any sort of analysis of the interplay between power outages and grid electrification. So I think
Great.
that would maybe be a next step, especially once we see what CMP and the other utilities produce in their integrated grid planning.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So Jen put another great comment in the chat that this is something we've been thinking about in our region's resilience project. We've been thinking about how to organize neighborhoods and rural areas so in a disaster storm, they could be ready to help each other. And that's a great point, that building neighborhood resilience and neighborhood communities is a really powerful resilience strategy, not just for power outages, but disaster events as a whole, because that's been really driven home to us in this planning process, is how power outages are just one aspect of a larger disaster event that needs to be planned for.
Karina, I would also flag that the town of Wyndham is actually applying for a community action grant that's going to be expanding almost the energy coaching side of like a program of going into a home to assess for energy efficiency upgrades, but it's going to be more focused on emergency management, hazard prep, specifically for older residents. The town of Wyndham actually had a weather-related death that was in the previous storm. But similar, like the power outages thing of vulnerable populations is something that's front of mind. So if awarded or if someone is interested, I'm happy to chat with those that would be wanting to know more.
Yeah, that's a really great idea, and yeah, hoping to see that get awarded in Wyndham. So there's a few more comments in the chat, and then I'm guessing we should probably wrap it up soon. So Molly mentioned here in Camden/Rockport, we're also considering neighborhood watch networks, part of our recent community resilience partnership grant. So perhaps that could be a future SMRCC webinar discussion with all these different projects going on. Jen mentioned Facebook has been helpful in the past. If cell towers go down, they cannot access it. And that's something we've heard as well about communications and cell towers and what to do when cell towers lose power, because some of them have generators, some of them don't, and the generators only last for so long. Andrew mentioned, I think all community members advocating for a strong PUC is ultimately the only way to encourage regulating utilities. Fair point. And then finally, Kate mentioned other folks to engage in these conversations that we've talked to directly are schools, housing development associations, community gathering spaces that provide services, not just shelters, water management entities, large energy users. And so those are all really great examples. I don't think we had talked about water management entities before. So thank you, Kate, for highlighting those folks. All right, any final comments or questions? Or Gretchen, I'll turn it back over to you.
No, thank you, Karina. I was getting so lost in the conversation that we were all having, and it was great to hear everyone's perspective that I was losing track of time. But thank you all. Again, we will be sending out a resource page, this recording, and the PowerPoints. And we definitely will be in touch with another workshop in our series, but you'll have to stay tuned on what the subject is. So you'll be surprised. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.